It is. Good afternoon. A couple of years ago, I was in a bookstore checking out a book that it wasn't a library, that's where you check out books. I was on the verge of buying a book, but really I was just test driving it because didn't bring any money with me on purpose because I know how I am. But I read a review on this book, looked like a pretty good book. Gonna go check it out, and I did my usual thing. Loved it. Went back a week later and bought it. It's just, don't want to do that impulse shopping kind of a thing. So, but anyway, my very first encounter with it, I opened it up to the middle, and there was one of these little cutout deals. Brand new book, really surprising. And it was cut out with one of those little hidey place things, and there was a turd in it. Literally a piece of poop. And I didn't throw it down because I didn't want, to splash up. So I just set it down, and then right next to it was another copy of the same book, same author, same title, but a different copy. And so I took it off the shelf, and this time I did something different. I went to page 1, and I started reading it from the first page, and like I said, I just stood there. And I didn't even look for a place to sit down. And I read the first 30 pages right there, and I was like, after about 20 pages, I knew I was going to buy it, but I still couldn't put it down. Like I said, came back with it, bought it. Now, why I'm talking about this now, here, why I think that this is important to us is that, you out there in YouTube land, I don't know how real you are. I mean, I know this is real, but you're not sure about you guys. That if this is all new to you, what I'm doing right now, you really should go back and watch the first one, The Woman with 1.5 Hands. It's the original. Watch it, then watch part 2, then part 3, 4, 5, and we'll see you back here in a little while. Anyway, here's part 13, or A Rape Prevention Principle? Subtitled, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It probably isn't. After casting doubt on the possibilities or likelihood of being able to find good answers to the suicide question in a variety of environmental and other areas that would trace back to individualistic-oriented causes, in other words, areas where one might get assistance from people like Freud or Carl A. Menninger, Durkheim asked those in psychology for their final answer. Their response? Imitation. To which Durkheim, after defining that word and then showing the only ways it should be used in terms of suicide, shot down this notion, point by point. Meanwhile, I'm remembering something from when he ruled out genetics as a cause of suicide, namely that Junior used a rope, in part because Uncle Boris used a rope. This is imitation in 2 ways, albeit only for Junior. 1, choosing suicide, and 2, choosing a rope for that suicide. Also, while demonstrating how race alone was not a very good predictor of suicide rates, Durkheim noted that while Germans living in Germany commit suicide more often than other races, move these Germans over to another country, and their suicide rate changes to match that of the local Slavs or Austrians, which certainly smacks of imitation to me. As if that weren't enough, turn to page 140, and the professor himself admits that, quote, imitation may give rise to more or less numerous individual cases, but it does not contribute to the unequal tendency in different societies to self-destruct, nor to that of smaller groups within each society to again self-destruct. Its radiating influence is always very restricted, and what's more, intermittent. Its attainment of a certain degree of intensity is always brief. End quote. Durkheim spent pages and pages defining terms like race, or sociology, or imitation. I wish he would have spent just a little bit of time defining what he meant by numerous, or used a different word. Be that as it may, it turns out my three hitches, rope, Germans in Austria, and numerous, have all the weight and importance of squabbles among kittens high on catnip. In other words, such qualms are effectively rendered superficial in light of Durkheim's final analysis of how far it's not going to get us if we settle for imitation being a serviceable answer to the question of suicide. Best illustrated by the following example. At Boulogne, France, Boulogne, at Boulogne, France, a soldier, while on guard duty, blew out his brains. Then the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that, his replacements did likewise. Same sentry box, same shift. To say imitation caused this series of suicides is to fail to answer the question of why in an actionable way. It's like you're in the middle of comporting yourself with all the bearing and demeanor of a professional, but then BAM! Your gavel makes a really loud noise because you've just slammed it. Quote, okay, we're done here. Cause? Imitation. Next case. What's next on the docket there, bailiff? End quote. Durkheim, on the other hand, wrote that the issue is not that suicide victims numbers 2 through whatever imitated those before them. It's that all of those suicidal soldiers, including the first one, were trying to send a message. They had tried reasoning with their immediate or local superiors about a beef, all to no avail. Yeah, but how big of a beef? Worthy of suicide. And number 2 agreed. Number 3, same thing, but with the added emphasis of, now they'll listen. The fourth in line and thereafter kept piling on. Same message, but by now it's in a sing-song voice. They're going to have to listen to us eventually. Here's where an unbiased observer might note that, about 50 words ago, the word reasoning implies that their superiors had been listening. Not where Durkheim was going with this. The superior officers, generals, captains, of the immediate superiors, sergeants, lieutenants, of the guards, foot soldiers, didn't hear a thing about their grievances before the suicides started happening. Part of the duty of sergeants and lieutenants is to be sponges and barriers, soak up the whining, but most of it stops with them. Generals don't want to hear about most of the mundane, and in fact, if your nation is to be even somewhat successful at war, generals can't hear about the trivial, at least not very much of it. But if multiple suicides happen in one specific area, and during a relatively short period of time, the superiors of the sergeants and lieutenants take note, and they send independent investigators to the troubled area, agents who snoop around and actually listen to the foot soldiers, followed by reprimands, concessions, compromise, changes in protocol, etc. Soon enough, the suicides go on the wane. This shortly will be tied in with rape prevention. But first, a suicide involves one person acting alone. As rape, by definition, has to involve 2 or more people, it's likely this difference will be the source of at least some of Durkheim's principles not being transferable to rape prevention. One point Durkheim outlined that might not be transferable to our topic is nonetheless worth discussing, if for no other reason than to demonstrate a Durkheimian point that, though instructive, is still not transferable, but might be. In other words, in an offbeat way, by showing approximately where boundaries are, this example will further help to explain Durkheim's approach to suicide prevention, which is to say, by examining this gray area, and by asking just how gray or black or white it is, we can be that much closer to understanding Durkheim's approach to exploding European suicide rates. Starting on page 45, Durkheim noted that a daredevil who intentionally toys with death while seeking to avoid it isn't/wasn't truly suicidal, even if he dies during a stunt or shortly thereafter. That said, Durkheim continued, daredevilry isn't radically distinct from true suicide. What a daredevil does, Durkheim concluded, forms a sort of embryonic suicide, and though it is not methodologically sound to confuse a daredevil's actions with complete and full suicide, the close relation of his actions to complete and full suicide must not be neglected. I think Professor Durkheim here was hinting at the kinds of forms his solutions to suicide were eventually going to be presented in, still some 300 or so pages away. In other words, without coming even close to spelling it out, he was saying that the same disease that's causing the symptom, suicide, to triple, is perhaps causing another symptom, a symptom that's taking the form of people being or watching daredevils. Jobs used to entail hunting or gathering, then some people got paid to build houses, followed by all sorts of other ways to get paid, provided one rendered a service or made something useful, or sat in an office. This guy's job was to die. An interrupter, poking his head over your cubicle's wall, and obviously just catching the tail end of this exchange, might guess, quote, "Okay, he's a soldier, right? Before he dies, he might bring booty or honor to his nation. Am I right?" End quote. No, different kind of dying. Anyway, I'll end the suspense. It's pure spectacle. Durkheim was saying, here we have people watching somebody who's perhaps decades away from dying a natural death, and they're paying to watch him possibly die at a much younger age, and in a spectacular way. This is a symptom of a diseased society. French suicide increasing 385% during a little more than half of the 19th century. That's also a symptom of a diseased society. And then Durkheim made his point. Certainly these are related diseases, if not one and the same disease. So keeping tabs on both, quote, must not be neglected, end quote. Now, there is a very rickety bridge linking the above to our topic. I'm sure many will say the following barely belongs in the footnotes, let alone right here in the main body of this project. But here I go anyway. In a tenuously related way, if a woman is married to a man whom her parents warned her against because she's always worn blue jeans and he's been wearing tailored suits since he was a toddler, and she doesn't want to have sex with him on a given night, but he sort of talks her into it anyway, but not really. What happened was she finally gave up and just laid there and took it, smirk never leaving her face, snide remarks never stopping. And that's it. She becomes part of Jaden and Tone's 80.9% of women who, after being raped, will tell a phone surveyor about it, but not the police. In the same way that a daredevil who died during a stunt didn't really commit suicide, is a woman who repeatedly gets raped or raped by a man who simply has too much money to say goodbye to, actually getting raped by that man. It's debatable if it's really rape. This is not a silly question, though, because I'm convinced that well over 99% of all stranger rapes get reported to the police. But the lion's share of rapes that don't get reported to the police are committed by men with just too much money in the eyes of the women they rape, or rape, and these women just happen to be their wives or girlfriends. One of the results of the above is that this boogeyman rapist, partially mythical, partially not so mythical figure gets blown up in stature and saddled onto a different horse. This half-mythical or three-quarters mythical boogeyman's actions become larger than life, grow in heinousness, grow in odiousness. And then, when some guy does go down for rape, after he truly raped, his sentence is much longer than what one who didn't know better might expect, in part because it's like society is trying to make up for not catching enough rapists, because society thinks there are a lot more rapists out there because of all these blown-up stats from researchers like Jaden and Tone that aren't really substantiated or are sort of halfway substantiated. Or to use Durkheim's term, they're in a sort of embryonic stage of being substantiated. Now, if we go ahead with my stratified rape shelter idea, tulips in the rain, as well as implement other anti-rape measures I've outlined throughout The Woman with 1.5 Hands. And if conviction rates for middle and upper-class rapists start matching or even approximating the rates of rape convictions for their low-income counterparts, then I predict something truly awful will happen. I predict we'll quickly see the prison sentences for convicted rapists drop to maybe 3 or fewer years, plus, no doubt, suddenly overcrowding. So maybe even for a spell, while we're waiting for all those new prisons to be built, the authorities might reduce sentences for rape to even less than 3 years. Unfounded? Proof? You want proof? Okay, take cocaine sentences for whites in the middle class, and then compare them to crack cocaine sentences for blacks and inner city types. Both involve the same substance. Why is there such a huge difference in lengths of sentences? Actual time spent behind bars is about quintuple for those convicted of inner city crack cocaine than it is for the suburban white cocaine. Exact figures and more discussion found in my notes. So if I'm correct about rape, and if magically or if logically, and with my stratified rape shelters and other methods, we could and do start busting more and more middle and upper class men for this crime, I predict sentences for rape would reflect this same white coke, black crack bias, and convicted rapists who are, say, middle class would get 3 years instead of what I've been advocating, 23 years. So there's good news and bad news. More men would get busted for rape, with my approval, but their stay behind bars would be shorter, which I don't agree with. Unfortunately, the above is likely, if history is a helpful indicator. Recall Jaden and Tone's 2.9 multiplier. It's in part 8 of this series. Of those surveyed who'd said they'd been raped in the previous 12 months, most of those 24 women also said they'd been raped more than once, and their totals amounted to 2.9 rapes per rape victim within the last year. Along those same lines, I think if one totals not number of rapists, but number of rape incidents, and then compares the number of rape incidents by strangers to the number of rape incidents by a husband or a live-in boyfriend, that it should be plain that stranger rape incidents amount to way fewer than 1% of all incidents of rape. Because that stranger will rape one time, or a few times in one afternoon, or one weekend, whatever, but a husband will rape for years and years and years. Which is to say, Jaden and Tone's 2.9 multiplier is probably a low figure, and, quote, must not be neglected, end quote. That's enough for this time. Next time, part 14, or Durkheim.